I've not exactly done many videos about wrestling from my home country, which is a bit odd and certainly something that needs fixing. Still, just because I'm looking towards the UK doesn't mean I'm going straight into the likes of Big Daddy, Giant Haystacks and Kendo Nagasaki. There are other curious itches worth scratching, particularly when it comes to the darker era of pro wrestling in the UK. The times when, well, you would struggle to find much in the way of homegrown wrestling on the telly. The days of millions of Grapple fans tuning into World of Sport were thoroughly over. The average British show was likely to consist of various people essentially doing tributes to the biggest talents across the pond as opposed to anything original, and you generally had a bunch of smaller companies, both old and new, fighting for scraps in their own fiefdoms. Still, there was the odd occasion where a federation would raise its head out of the swamp and get on some telly channel somewhere, even if it were only briefly. And I want to talk about one specific promotion who fits this bill today, chiefly because they're one that I actually watched at the time. The Ultimate Wrestling Alliance, or UWA, had a TV show back in 1999. It only ran for 21 episodes, but I'm sure I watched most of them. As we'll see, there's some good things about their product, and some pretty damn bad things too, but there's also a chance to see some young and very promising talents going at it, some intriguing stories here and there, and a chance to generally look at the state of British wrestling at this time, and a few of its characters. Still, in many ways, looking at the UWA and their show, Wrestling Rampage, just about all of which is available on YouTube, is mainly a nostalgia trip, a chance to have some fun looking at something I largely haven't seen for over 25 years. So, what are we waiting for? Let's get on it. You want some heavy stuff? Well, we're gonna beat ya. To summarise briefly, when we talk about the dark ages of British wrestling, we're pretty much talking about the whole of the 90s and beyond. It's quite a long time, something that started when wrestling was dropped from ITV's schedule in 1988. Greg Dyke, then the new director of programmes for London Weekend Television, saw the wrestling as being rather outdated. It didn't exactly help that both the viewership and quality were far down from its peak, and that ITV were generally far behind in ratings to the BBC, and so it was axed. Dyke didn't specifically have a vendetta against wrestling, and it was far from the only thing that he got rid of, but it was all part of an effort to try and make ITV's product a bit more modern, also chop in some of the more old-fashioned game shows and the like. From this point on, the idea of wrestling in the UK changes completely for most regular folk. Sky TV has wrestling on satellite TV in 1989, but of course it's WWF, and it couldn't be more different from what British wrestling was. The nearly 80,000 people who fill up Wembley Stadium for SummerSlam on August 29, 1992 may represent a sizable audience, but generally it's not an audience that'd give two hoots about a technical 6-round 2-falls-to-1 classic between Johnny Saint and Clive Myers. The almighty spectacle of the WWF almost immediately relegated classic British wrestling to a long-distant past in the eyes of the casual viewer, as if it all ended decades ago, instead of being taken off telly a couple years previously. Quickly, it should be noted that early adopters of satellite in the UK would have been able to enjoy WWF wrestling on Rupert Murdoch's Sky Channel from as early on as 1984, so it's not as if ITV could have just replaced British wrestling with the Fed, as it was already sewn up. By the time that satellite TV boomed in the UK and was adopted by many more people in around 1989, 1990, 91, WWF was a flagship programme on the service, one of the main selling points, the Sky One schedule chock full of Wrestling Challenge, Superstars, Primetime and pay-per-views that we got for free. When the wrestling was cancelled on ITV, Max Crabtree, head of Joint Promotions, essentially the UK's version of the NWA and pretty much the dominant force in the country for years, went to Sky to try and get the British wrestling on there, but obviously that didn't work out. It would have cost Max 20 grand per show to produce a TV product that was up to Sky's standards, whereas the WWF were simply sending tapes over from across the pond. Max wasn't going to make any money. You may still get wrestling on TV in some parts of the UK at this time. Orridge Williams' Reslaw, for example, ran until 1995 on Channel 4's Welsh language offshoot, S4C, and the state of play in mainland Europe is generally a lot healthier thanks to the efforts of promotions like Austria and Germany's CWA, for example. But in England, yeah, times are tough. It's hard for anyone to garner much attention now that the telly's gone, and promotions naturally suffer. Joint Promotions, having spent its last couple of years under the new and fancier name of Ring Wrestling Stars, tried to keep going and briefly had British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith as its top star in 1994 before he went back to WWF, Smith essentially replacing the retired Big Daddy Shirley Crabtree in the main slot, but they ultimately folded in 1995 following the retirement of Max Crabtree. Some of the old guard survive in the 90s through cannier operation, such as Brian Dixon's All-Star Wrestling. They're not on TV, but they can call on the likes of Kendo Nagasaki and Mark Rollerball Rocco to headline shows at holiday camps and their home venues, thus managing to retain a strong live audience for at least a few years. Now, this is but a brief summary, of course, hardly scratching the surface, but Finns generally aren't good. Hell, they really aren't good by the time we get to the late 90s. This is about the stage where we see a lot of the aforementioned and kind of infamous tribute shows, complete with acts like the UK Undertaker, people pretending to be The Rock, Steve Austin, Kane, the Road Warriors and so on. You know, it's funny. Nowadays folks may look at these posters and assume them to be some kind of AI-generated slop, but I can assure you that these flyers are totally real. This is what companies were reduced to a lot of the time, simply to try and get some sort of audience. There's not much that's actually British about British wrestling at this time. It is kind of bittersweet to say it, but at around the time the UWA was taking form in 1998, there was a bit of a tension in the shape of a remembrance of Finn's past, not just because it had been 10 years since the wrestling had last graced screens, but by far the two best known figures in the whole of British wrestling, Big Daddy Shirley Crabtree and Giant Haystacks, passed away just inside a year of each other at this time. Daddy died of a stroke on 2nd December 1997, and Haystacks succumbed to lymphoma on 29th of November 98. The passing of these once huge stars did spark a certain wonder as to just what the state of British wrestling was at the time for those who hadn't thought about it in years and, well, Finns were shit. Still, wrestling itself is in very good shape by this time, particularly when it comes to the WWF. It's a boom period, and so perhaps it's a time when a new, young promotion could try and assert itself, to go beyond the tribute shows, to perhaps even get on telly and try to attract some of the many new eyes that are interested in wrestling as a whole. And so, enter the UWA. The brainchild of concert promoters Andrew and Paul Martin and former WWF and Sky producer Dan Belinka, the Ultimate Wrestling Alliance was set up in 1998 with a pretty simple brief: to take advantage of the wrestling boom and get a British wrestling promotion back on TV. They did manage to do this, of course, although it didn't necessarily turn out the way that they'd hoped. The company's first event was Judgement Night, taking place on the 18th of October 1998 in Epping, in front of 600 fans. Now sadly there's no visual footage available here, but there were by all accounts a lot more flashy lights and pyrotechnics than you'd usually associate with British wrestling at this time. It was a much more American presentation, for lack of a better word. The card was main evented by Phil Powers, a guy who was kind of singled out from the start as one of the upstart promotion's top stars, and a man who, for better or worse, was one of the biggest names on the UK indie scene at the time. The Dirt Bike Kid, a mostly untrained stuntman who still gained a following by putting together shows where he would bring in the likes of Sabu, Rob Van Dam and other actually good talents. Now, the man himself is a bit of a dick, the show's most certainly lost a lot of money, and he's obviously mostly famous now for the utter braying he took at the hands of Great Sasuke in Michinoku Pro, but the handful of Dirt Bike Kid run European Wrestling Association, or EWA events were certainly different and important. They were aimed at smarks, and they helped bring quite a few people together who would be influential later on. Anywho, the hardcore chaotic stylings of Dirt Bike Kid clashed with the UWA's ambitions immediately. The DBK Phil Powers main event was a total mess, and he acrimoniously left the promotion straight after. There's an interview with him from May 1999 in the Wrestling Post where he badmouths UWA aplenty, saying he never believed anything that Dan Belinka said to him, that the match he had with Powers was the shits, and the UWA screwed around with all of his planned spots, no one was taking them seriously, and so on. There's even an intriguing bit where the Wrestling Post interviewer implies that the UWA itself weren't happy with a merely good report on the show, saying that they wanted them to say it was the best wrestling show to ever happen on British soil. Now, regardless of the truth of any of this, the UWA had got itself some quick notoriety, and their efforts to make a more modern, homegrown British wrestling product quickly earned them some press inches, such as this December '98 article that ran in The Independent, in which the UWA guys are profiled. Paul Martin confesses that he knows little about wrestling itself, but he thinks that his background in concert promotion could be a strength, while Dan Belinka's 4 years spent working with the WWF is also highlighted, and we get some words from a few of the stars that we're going to be seeing in the UWA. The aforementioned Phil Powers, Stevie Knight and Iron Duke Lynch all get a mention, as is the fact that this one show had been enough for the UWA to find their way to television. Well, television of a sort. It's worth spending a bit of time talking about the channel that UWA ended up broadcasting on, as, well, if I'm honest, the channel is as interesting, if not more, than the promotion itself is. Live TV was a cable channel set up in 1995 by former The Sun editor Kelvin Mackenzie and BBC Two youth and entertainment head Janet Street Porter, the latter of whom quickly fell out with Mackenzie and left, essentially replaced by Nick Ferrari, fellow tabloid journo and Kelvin's mate. The brief of live TV was essentially to be a televised tabloid newspaper, which shows in the somewhat infamous content the channel put out. News reports were often accompanied by a news bunny, the channel's mascot that would mime in the background. There's things like Agony, a televised version of the Dear Deirdre type agony aunt columns you would get in The Sun or The Mirror or whatever. Paranormal type guff like The Y-Files, Spanish Archer, where people try and entertain a crowd with their act and get the El Bo if they fail. Britain's bounciest weather with former Oompa Loompa Rusty Goth, a terrible soap opera called Canary Wharf, which is where live TV was based, the odd bit of sport, and of course, a lot of titillation. Everything from daytime frolics like The Weather in Norwegian with Anne-Marie Voss and Tiffany's Big City Tips, to the late night full frontal likes of Topless Darts and endless episodes of The Red Shoe Diaries or other erotic softcore thrillers. It's all a load of crap, of course, but amusingly nostalgic crap that's mostly available to watch on YouTube. Honestly, a wrestling programme does fit in pretty nicely with the majority of Live's output, so it's not a surprise that UWA ended up there. Indeed, Live TV had previously reached out to Brian Dixon's All-Star in order to get them on the channel, but Dixon rejected the offer, seeing as Live wasn't actually offering them any money. Eventually, a spot for wrestling goes to the UWA, and their programme, Wrestling Rampage, begins broadcasting on the 8th of May 1999. It would last for 21 episodes and, well, by now you're probably eager to see just what the Ultimate Wrestling Alliance put out there. Was this the start of a bright new future for British wrestling? Not really. The UWA's 21 episodes were largely pulled from 3 big sets of tape-ins. The first batch of 5 were recorded on the 11th of April in front of 1,200 people at the Crystal Palace Indoor Arena in London. There was a marathon of 9 episodes taped at the Blackpool Ice Arena on 10th of June. God help anyone who went to that. And then a final set of 4 tape-ins happened on the 4th of September at Barking's Broadway Theatre, in front of 500 fans. In the midst of this, we also have a show recorded at the Bulldog Bash in Stratford-upon-Avon on the 8th of August in front of a load of bikers, essentially the closest the UWA gets to WCW's Road Wild, and 2 of the 21 episodes are basically clip shows. There's no big pay-per-view event or supercard or anything like that, so we've just got 21 60-odd minute episodes, around 45 minutes of action apiece without the ad breaks. Although the promotion didn't last all that long, they actually had 3 titles: a regular UWA Championship, a UWA TV Championship, and tag team belts. Happily, Tim Hassel has uploaded all the UWA episodes onto YouTube bar one, that being episode 18, and he's got a few other cool things like a lot of old FWA TV episodes, or other short-lived oddities like Transatlantic Wrestling Challenge. Of course, there will be a link in the description. Now, while it would be utter madness to go through every single episode of UWA Wrestling Rampage, as they are all kind of similar to each other, we will start by going through the first one to get an idea of just what a regular one was like, and then naturally we will highlight other notable things that happened in the one. You may hope that this means looking at a bunch of good or perhaps even hidden gem matches, but largely it doesn't. UWA is in many ways trying to emulate the American TV style of the time, in particular the WWF style, which isn't exactly big on in-ring action and much more centred around storylines, endless turns, and a whole load of interrupted bouts. And of course, UWA is going to be much weaker than the Fed in every way when it comes to this sort of thing. Various people who have recapped the UWA's one have posited that this WWF aping kind of style makes the UWA feel a bit like the worst parts of old Vince Russo era TNA, only it happened years before that company was even a glint in Dixie Carter's eye. So, the first episode. It all starts on the 14th of May with a little montage sequence and a rather odd theme that is basically just a load of drumming. We then head over to Dan Belinka, for it is he, in the studio. He'll be providing most of the links to the action and promos in the episodes. Now, this cut into the studio could be thought of as similar to a B-level WWF show or whatever, although it is actually something of a throwback to the old World of Sport days, where wrestling was a regular segment that appeared alongside the likes of football and horse racing, and everything would be linked by host Dickie Davis in the studio. The first match, if nothing else, does a good job of introducing the top face and heels. We've got Flying Phil Powers, apparently UWA's resident Mr. Nice, up against Mad Dog McPhee, who's managed by a fella named Steve Linsky. This rivalry goes back to the original Judgement night show where Linsky tried to interfere in a match between Powers and Doug Williams, and it was promoted on another live TV show called Catfights where McPhee powerbombed Powers through a table. Now, Powers is an ultra-classic white meat babyface, a total blue-eye of the sort who actually seems a bit of an anachronism in the wrestling world of 1999. McPhee is a heavy, long-haired type who looks like he should be fronting a band like The Almighty or something, and Linsky, well, he is a typical heel manager, but he's got a rather dodgy-sounding American accent.
But tonight, it's gonna be taken care of, and who better to take care of it than the Mad Dog?
The match itself isn't anything special and ends up being rather brief. Powers rolls McPhee up when the latter's looking for the win to get a free count, much to the heel's displeasure. The announcements make it clear that this is the first British wrestling match to be nationally televised since 1988, and as a start, well, it's average in the ring, and average on the presentation front. We've got loud music and lasers for each grappler's entrance, a crowd that is initially at least a bit receptive, and commentary from the team of play-by-play man Russ Gordon and colour guy Steve Morgan, which, well, if I'm honest, isn't too hot. But there's going to be more reasons to complain as we go on. Before we head into the next match, we get an appearance from a British wrestling legend who's also going to be UWA's commissioner. None other than Mick McManus, who gets quickly interviewed by our ring announcer, a job that's taken by Paul Martin. Now, while the 79-year-old McManus does admittedly look a lot like Leroy Jenkins with the suit and jet black dyed hair and what have you, he's still here to say that his word is law, and to give a little interview saying that his job's to deal with anyone who's moaning and messing about and all that. From there, we go to our next match, a tag team bout between the lighter face team of Too Far Gone, that's Essex boys Paul Tyrrell and Steve Morco, versus the heavy heel Northern team of the Death Squad, Iron Duke Dave Lynch and Hammer Mark Myers, who somewhat incongruously are led out to the ring by two very cheerful ladies known as the Tiny Girls. Lynch, a guy in his early 30s who already looks like a thoroughly grizzled veteran, does a little promo, and the two teams get to work. Now, again, it's generally quite average TV stuff with a few rather messy bits here and there, and to be honest, the main intriguing bit is the huge difference between the heel big bastards and their very giggly managers. Anywho, a rather confusing sequence ultimately leads to the Death Squad isolating one of Too Far Gone, hitting their rather neat Sheffield Hammer finisher, and winning, with a somewhat short-tempered Mark Myers attempting to continue the beating after the bell. "Ah, leave 'em alone," says Lynch. "The Southern Fairies have learnt their lesson." Oh, and the Death Squad come out to a sped-up karaoke take on Smells Like Teen Spirit. Again, it's all rather weird, but I'm not immediately hating it. I surely wonder if they donned some face paint and shoulder pads at some earlier point and did some time as a tribute act. I know that Lynch at least was often billed as the Legend of Doom later in his career, which goes all the way up to the 2010s. Anyway, we've got potential in the next match, which reveals a partnership with another promotion. UWA have teamed up with Michinoku Pro Wrestling, and here we've got a match between Tiger Mask 4 and Jason Cross for the vacant British Commonwealth Junior Heavyweight Championship. Now, this belt was originally created in 1995, during a time when Michinoku was partnered up with All Star Wrestling. The initial champion was the late Doc Dean. From there, the belt became part of the almighty 8-title J-Crown in 1996, meaning it can count the likes of Great Sasuke, Ultimo Dragon, Jushin Liger and Shinjiro Atani among its lineage. It was vacated when the J-Crown was dissolved, won again in 1998, and then vacated again. The UWA mentions that the title was vacant due to it not being defended by the previous champion for 60 days, although for obvious frictional reasons they do not mention that said previous champion was the Dirt Bike Kid, who reactivated the belt after defeating Mikey Whipwreck in February of '98, and then returned it in some sort of angle earlier in 1999 where, if his shoot interviews are to be believed, he smashed Tiger Mask over the head with the belt. There was a big angle fight captured by Weekly Pro Wrestling's cameras for a bout that never came to fruition. The whole thing made headlines in Japan and apparently could have soured UWA and Michinoku's relationship if DBK hadn't chosen to play ball, and so on and so on and so forth. The match between Tiger Mask 4 and Jason Cross has been going on while I've been trying to eat my way through all this chin music, and again, it's not bad. It's perfectly fine junior style action, although the commentary is really getting on my wick. The heel commentator, Steve Morgan, particularly grinds my gears at points, I have to say. It's like Jerry Lawler, only more obnoxious and very shouty. His most memorable line is saying that Tiger Mask looks like he should be in a panto, which isn't saying a lot.
Aerial abilities. Tiger Mask.
He looks like he's in panto.
Doesn't get a count there. Another cover by Tiger Mask. Gets a 1 count. And what a confrontation we're having. A great match and possibly one of the best matches we'll see this year.
Oh my God, this is one of the biggest matches this year!
Anywho, Tiger Mask ultimately grabs the vacant title after a moonsault, and the broadcast hypes up the appearance of Guan Naniwa next week. Still, there is more action to go from this week, but what do we make of the happenings so far? Watching this back for the first time in a long time, it's pretty so-so. I don't want to put UWA on some sort of pedestal of badness and say that this was a completely hopeless attempt at a British wrestling revival, because it wasn't all that terrible in the grand scheme of things. Believe me, there have been much worse attempts at trying to relight that particular candle. If, like me, you were a teenager who watched plenty of live TV back then, even if you perhaps shouldn't have, you probably enjoyed UWA somewhat. I know I did then. Watching it now, you can see it's something that's in trying to modernise the ideal of British wrestling and get away from thoughts of Big Daddy, Admiral Lord Mountevans rules, grannies hitting heels with their handbags and what have you, is still struggling to find an identity of its own. This will become more apparent as we look at what else went on during the show's run. For now, however, we carry on with the first episode and meet our next prominent star, a man who is one of the more infamous wrestlers in the promotion's history, although he undoubtedly has the most interesting backstory. Big Papa T. Papa T, real name Makasi Shikeva, hails from the Congo, a son of a senior lieutenant in what was Len Zaire's army, who ended up being poisoned by Joseph Desire Mobutu, then the country's leader. Makasi himself joined the army, also becoming a proficient amateur wrestler, much like his father, and even surviving plots that were laid to kill him before he decided to seek asylum in the UK in 1991, later opening up a wrestling school in Haringey in 95. Nowadays, he's still coaching at the same school, he's also a teacher, and the majority of his children are athletes in their own right, with one of his sons, Jamie, currently holding the British heavyweight boxing title. And here in 1999, well, he's the masked Big Papa T, and we get our first look at him here against Mark Sloan. Is the match good? No. It's a rather awful squash which T wins handily following a Texas cloverleaf. Amusingly, Papa T is kind of presented initially as a heel, complete with a manager named Rebecca, but his somewhat goofy moves and dancing kind of get the crowd cheering for him more than anything. Now, Papa T may well be responsible for some of the worst matches in UWA's short history. One particular bout against a man named Tom Monroe from episode 7 is really quite the stinker, but between the dancing and the backstory, you kinda can't help but find him endearing. The last match from this first episode sees Paul Sloan, the protege of Phil Powers, going up against a name you may recognise, Johnny Storm, who's also under the charge of Steve Linsky. Phil Powers talks him up beforehand with a babyface promo, saying that Sloan's not going to need his help tonight, and, well, the match itself doesn't last too long as, inevitably, McPhee and Linsky come down, resulting in McPhee twatting Sloan with a drink behind the ref's back, allowing Storm to pick up a dodgy pin. A beatdown follows which naturally sees Powers coming in to make the save, and inevitably results in Mick McManus making Teddy Long style moves. The show ends with a panicking interviewer named Jamila asking what on earth's going to happen now, and McManus quickly booking a tag match for next week.
Quite a situation we've got going at the moment, Mick.
Well, not really. We can resolve it, have a tag match, and we'll have it right here next week.
More drumming and, well, we're out of here. So, as a first show, how would I rate this? It's meh. You've got the appropriate callbacks to UK wrestling legend, you've got a bit of a hook to tune in next week, with the promise of also seeing the likes of Doug Williams, Stevie Knight, Christopher Daniels and Gwan Naniwa in action, and you've got a bit of an attempt at glitzy presentation. On the whole, it does still feel rather cheap though. Now, perhaps that isn't surprising considering that the show's on live TV. Everything on live TV is cheap, so I shouldn't necessarily specifically bag on UWA Wrestling Rampage for feeling like that. The quality of wrestling is, at best, humdrum TV standard. Nothing too brilliant or even all that good, but at this stage it's not like the UWA's building up to a big event. They've just got this weekly show, so perhaps it's a shame that the action isn't better than what it is. But again, this is 1999, and UWA are kind of trying to be like the WWF, so we perhaps shouldn't be surprised if matches largely have screwy finishes and the like. It's not exactly the best start, to say the least, but hey, perhaps it'll get better as the episodes go on. If you want a cohesive storyline out of UWA Wrestling Rampage, you generally find it in the first 6 episodes of the show, or rather the initial Crystal Palace taping. The storyline isn't necessarily amazing, but there's a progression from week to week as we head to a big 10-man gauntlet match on episode 6 to crown the inaugural UWA TV champion, and we gradually get introduced to various faces, whether they be Phil Powers and Steve Linsky, Stevie Knight and Doug Williams, and so on. This first one is also where you'll find Tiger Mask 4, Gwan Naniwa and Christopher Daniels making their appearances on the show, and that definitely helps with the wrestling quality, along with providing some historically neat things, like an early meeting between Daniels and Williams. You'll see a bunch of guys who were young and definitely had potential. Guys like Johnny Storm and a still teenage Jodie Fleisch, billed as Jodie Flash, who gets in the ring for a bout against hot stuff Stevie Knight, himself a fine talent and a part of the big old Norfolk Knight family, who kinda got his career curtailed a little after spending 3 years out of the ring due to a neck injury. Kenny Cabrero and Jason Cross also impress a bit in their matches, the former being a daredevil-type wrestler who manages to get a win against Gran Lanero in episode 2, and a young Alex Shane, pretty damn important name in 2000s britwres, makes an appearance in episode 3, losing in a tag match to the Death Squad. It's not a bad group of guys, really. There's a few folks who perhaps aren't quite ready for the telly, but UWA are definitely working with a bunch of the best British wrestling talent that's out there, a lot of whom definitely fall into the young and hungry category. The group of Shane, Storm, Fleisch and Williams in particular stand out for what they're going to end up doing together with the Frontier Wrestling Alliance. Still, we do get some very amusing daft crap in the midst of these first 6 episodes. Amusing crap like the Scrapyard. This gets introduced in episode 3 when Mad Dog McPhee has a match there with Tom Monroe, apparently as a way to warm himself up for the upcoming TV title gauntlet. And oh boy, it's a bloody mess. You get cutaways throughout to a mysterious group headed by the ever-amusing Steve Linsky, as well as 2 officials who are later revealed to be Dino Scarlo and a woman named Sorcha, all while the wrestlers do various spots in this junkyard, throwing bits of crap at each other, taking bumps on the ground, all sorts of nonsense. It all ends in quite violent fashion actually when McPhee picks Monroe up and does a frickin' kneeling pile driver on top of a car. Of all the things I expected to see in UWA, I must say that I didn't expect to see a frickin' Kawada driver on a clapped out motor. It's rather hilariously bad and perhaps not the safest thing ever, although I will give UWA credit. The Scrapyard is much more entertaining than WCW's Junkyard Invitational. It probably cost about 20 quid to put on as opposed to millions of dollars, and it didn't even injure anybody. The Scrapyard returns in the next episode with a big segment where it's revealed that Dino Scarlo, son of legendary UK wrestler and promoter Tony Scarlo, is illicitly setting up these junkyard bouts. This is explained while another bunch of dodgy spots take place, 2 guys named Rera and Frank duking it out with kicks that make Glacier look like Loki, while also occasionally throwing things like traffic cones at each other. We then immediately get a second Scrapyard match. Alex Shane's tag partner Leon Murphy is here for a bout, the opponent hasn't shown up, and so Dino Scarlo himself decides he's going to have a go and surprises Murphy with an attack. Why? Well, beats me. Murphy and Scarlo do the usual fighting and messing around. I should say that Dino is a wrestler and a trainer in his own right, before the fight apparently ends with Murphy busting his hand on a caravan. It is really quite funny. We then get an interview with Steve Linsky in the studio doing his best Paul Heyman impression, where it's pretty much explained that these Scrapyard bouts are no longer allowed. Linsky is hilarious once again, perhaps not intentionally, but the massive overacting and ridiculous American accent is definitely something.
This is toughening my man up, giving him that competitive edge for the 10-man tournament. Secondly, you know me. What does Steve Linsky do? What does he always try and do? Make money.
Especially seeing as said accent is all over the place, going on and off faster than a flickering light bulb in a crack den. I'm really not sure why the fellow is trying to put on an American accent, but yeah, it's rubbish. It is at least better than Daniel Craig's one in Tomb Raider, mind you.
I want them all down! Take them, carry them across the ladders! Come on, guys, let's hustle!
Anywho, after we get an extended look at some of the competitors in episode 5, we get the big TV title Gauntlet Battle Royal style match in episode 6. The whole thing generally goes off okay, although some of the big storyline beats do get a little wasted. There's a whole thread where Doug Williams, who has something of a frictional relationship with Linsky, gets put in a match with Chris Daniels and loses, meaning that he has to start the gauntlet at number 1. This also results in a bit of a kerfuffle with Stevie Knight. It's some of the strongest story work in UWA, and you might expect that Williams will go on a bit of a run in the gauntlet. Not necessarily winning, but getting an underdog treatment, the crowd behind him, a bit of a face turn and so on. This doesn't happen really. He manages to eliminate both Big Papa T and Paul Sloan, but then faces off with Stevie Knight, the end result being a kinda messy double elimination early doors. Most of the other bouts are then just very quick affairs, folks like Mad Dog McPhee and Johnny Storm simply disappearing in short order, before we do end with a somewhat lengthier and meatier final bout between Phil Powers and Christopher Daniels, who enters last and, being Chris Daniels, manages to carry Powers to something that's half decent. Ultimately, and not too surprisingly, it's Powers who manages to take the big win, slingshotting Daniels over the ropes after blocking an attempt at the Angels wins and claiming the TV title. Phil Powers has obviously been set up as the big face in UWA, even if he is such a throwback, so it's kinda natural that he gets the win. The trouble with UWA is that, well, after these first 6 episodes, a lot of things kinda disappear, and the booking quickly descends into rushed chaos. Tiger Mask, Gwen Nanira and Chris Daniels were only around for the first night of tapings, so we won't be seeing them again. And oddly, the same applies to Mick McManus. He's supposed to be the man in charge at the UWA, but seemingly he was only booked for one night, so we won't be seeing him again. Hell, there isn't even anything in the way of people from live TV itself appearing for guest bits. We see the likes of Anna-Marie Foss and Tiffany Bannister, hosts of Weather in Norwegian and Tiffany's Big City Tips respectively, showing up in the first few episodes to be guest ring announcers, but that quickly dries up. Other intriguing if not exactly great things disappear. The scrapyard gets hyped up as this dangerous place, somewhere where we may perhaps see something big. Perhaps Phil Powers is going to have to brave it at some point. Doug Williams and Stevie Knight settle their big rivalry there, or whatever. But no, it has a 2-episode storyline and then it disappears into the ether, never to be mentioned again. Indeed, the whole storyline for a TV title seems like a waste when, at the start of episode 7, it's announced that Danny Royal is going to take on Blondie Barrett, who we haven't seen at all so far, for a shot at the UWA title. No, not the UWA TV title, the UWA title, a belt that we have yet to see but will apparently be competed for in a triple trouble match between Doug Williams, Kenny Cabrero and Stevie Knight, for no other reason except that they eliminated people in the 10-man gauntlet. To be honest, all of this is just bloody stupid. You spend 6 weeks of programming hyping up this bloody TV championship, and then after someone wins it, you basically bin it for something that's apparently more important 5 minutes into the next episode. What was the point of the last 6 weeks? The TV title still exists, of course, but it kind of undercuts old Phil Powers a bit. Like, why not just make all of that for the actual UWA championship, and then run this for the TV title? It certainly feels more natural that way. Those who came up short compete for the second belt, rather than competing for what is obviously the first one. I mean, it's the heavyweight championship, that's what you're conditioned to believe in wrestling, right? Oh, and if this wasn't bad enough, the same episode sees the Death Squad make an appearance and introduce the UWA tag team titles. How did they win those straps? I don't know, they basically just show up with their own belts, say that they're the champs, and it happens by default. Between all this, an advert for the UWA premium rate phone line that's going to provide you with all the latest UWA and wrestling news for a 5 or a minute or whatever, the horrific Big Papa T vs Tom Munro match and a woeful Phil Powers promo, episode 7 is kinda where UWA utterly falls off the rails, never really recovering from this point. The moment the show steps into Blackpool, everything's completely buggered. What happened? Did everyone go on a 5-day bender at the Norbreck Castle before booking this? Dodgy burger at Pleasure Beach? Fist fight with Sid Little? Who the bloody hell knows? Either way, it's garbage. A big problem with UWA from episode 7 onwards is how rushed everything feels. Some guys just get introduced with barely as much as a hello, and suddenly they're fighting for a title. A whole lot of turns happen, but generally speaking they don't make all that much sense. Too Far Gone end up beating Death Squad for the tag belts at one stage, only they're the heels for no real reason other than the old generic "we deserve better and we no longer like you people" guff. While Doug Williams does manage to get a proper face turn after winning the aforementioned UWA Championship in episode 8 and turning on Steve Linsky's mob, his former rival Stevie Knight doesn't get the same treatment. He kind of turns heel just because Kenny Cabrera is another one who ends up having a rather inexplicable heel turn that's hardly explained and barely justified. Big Papa T, who also ends up briefly holding the tag straps with Jody Fleisch, pretty much stays face for the duration, although he ends up stuck with a thoroughly miserable storyline involving some strange fellow and ex-army comrade of his named Frank that ultimately just relegates him to the sidelines, while Mad Dog McPhee also becomes something of an afterthought once the first few episodes are finished, even though he was positioned initially as top heel. There are two things that are generally consistent, one of which is good and one of which is bad. The bad one? Well, unfortunately that's Phil Powers. Powers stays totally blue-eye for the whole of the run, but whenever he takes centre stage, it can honestly be painful sometimes. He has this really terrible habit of kipping up and flipping around like nothing's happened to him, even after a tough match. His promos are rather dull, especially when they go for any length of time, and he kind of has Hogan-style booking in which he never actually looks weak. He feuds with Stevie Knight, which results in Knight winning the TV belt in episode 14, but naturally the feud is totally screwy throughout, filled with silly finishers, and culminating in a match where the title can change hands via disqualification. Now, despite all sorts of illegal things happening during the match, the DQ is only called when Powers hits Knight with, of all things, an MVC sign. Yes, that is a sign for the old music and video club shop that might have been on your high street. Wonder how much they paid for that spot. Oh, and the DQ is called by special referee Paul Sloan, which signals a heel turn for him and a feud with Powers, his former mentor. Powers himself isn't terrible in the ring or anything like that, not exactly great but not unwatchable, but UWA constantly pushing him down the throats of the viewing several makes him completely unbearable after a few episodes. If there's one generally good thing, one person who is absolutely consistent through the whole of UWA's 21 episode run, and who certainly comes off well throughout the whole of it, even getting the odd storyline beat that's decent and well thought out, well, it's probably no surprise who it is. It's the anarchist Doug Williams. Williams isn't quite at the height of his powers yet, that's still a few years away, but he is definitely the closest thing the UWA have to a worthy main eventer and a proper champion. He's got the skills, he can cut a decent promo, there's charisma in the ring, psychology, while there are other guys like Jody Fleisch, Johnny Storm, Stevie Knight and Danny Royal who definitely have potential here, Williams quite clearly has more about him than anyone else. If there is one definite highlight of the whole UWA run, it's when the 44-year-old Drew McDonald, a veteran from the World of Sport days, comes in for a quick heel one as part of Linsky's mob to challenge for Williams' title. McDonald also cuts fine promos, still works great as a monster heel, there's a storyline head injury for Williams that actually makes sense, and it culminates with the pair having a legitimately very decent title match that might just be the best bout in UWA's short history. It's not a must-watch classic, but it's pretty good. For all the crap, whether it be a Blackpool crowd that's reduced to near silence after enduring hours of punishing tapings, a show in front of a load of bikers who generally have the same bemused and nonplussed reaction that the American 1%ers had during WCW's annual jaunt to Sturgis, the confusing storylines, dodgy accents, obnoxious commentary and so on, Williams is pretty much the one thing that always feels like a breath of fresh air, a moment of relaxation amidst the general mess that is everything else. So, it should be obvious by now that I can't possibly recommend that you sit down and watch all of UWA Wrestling Rampage. By and large, you'll find yourself having a rather poor time if you do so. Not terrible, just very poor. Is it the worst thing to ever happen to British wrestling? No, of course not. Not even close. There are many, many worse attempts in the history of British wrestling to get a spark back into the business than this one. In the main, watching UWA Wrestling Rampage just ends up being kind of dull. It's funny really in that while it's certainly different to the awful tribute act shows that scourged the scene around this time, it does end up feeling like a weak tribute of another kind, an attempt to bring American-style storylines and glitz to British wrestling, Attitude Era vintage, that in the end falls way short. Honestly, a lot of the time the most interesting thing about each of the uploaded episodes on YouTube is that largely they retain the ad breaks. And who boy did live TV advertise some questionable crap. Craftmatic bed ads that feature everything short of saying that this bed is totally ideal for shagging on, mystical tarot phone lines that probably cost about a tenner a minute, kneecap finance style adverts that guarantee you'll be able to get credit for a car or mortgage or whatever even if you haven't got a pot to piss in, and the almighty Chelsea Building Society, an advert which those of a certain age who watched UK cable channels like Live TV can probably recite word for word, even if they haven't seen it in 25 years.
You can buy that house of yours, let alone back it.
And of course, ads for Live's own rubbish programming, things like Banners and Smash, Agony, No Tomorrow, and the promise that this rather mediocre attempt at grappling will be over in 15 minutes, with US import Judge Judy next up on the schedule. Anyway, before we leave UWA behind, we obviously need to look at how it all ended, because that also may give us some clues as to just why the end product ended up feeling so rushed and chaotic. The 21st and final episode of UWA Wrestling Rampage aired on the 25th of September 1999, and it largely wrapped up most of the existing story threads. A triple threat tag title bout sees Too Far Gone, still healing it up, retain the belts against the teams of Papa T and Fleisch and McPhee and Johnny Storm, the latter of which are now managerless after Steve Linsky was banished in the penultimate episode, thanks to Doug Williams winning a gauntlet match against his mob. The Phil Powers and Paul Sloan storyline wraps up with an absolute stinker of a hardcore match that's inevitably won by Powers, who naturally backflips around in pure Teddy Hart fashion after scoring the victory. And lastly, there is a decent end. Danny Royal, someone who started UWA as pretty much a basic curtain jerker with not too much story, has slowly made his way up the table, become a face, and he defeats Doug Williams to win the UWA title in a match that's actually perfectly decent. With that, the initial 21 episode run of UWA Wrestling Rampage comes to an end, with Steve Morgan signing off by saying that it ain't over until it's over. But, well, it most certainly was over, I'm afraid. The ultimate fate of UWA is, as it goes, kind of inextricably aligned with the fate of the channel that carried it, Live TV. A little over a month after the last episode of UWA Wrestling Rampage aired, Live TV ceased broadcasting on the 5th of November 1999. While the channel had often got attention for some of the ridiculously stupid things it did, having a news bunny that would mime crying while reports played of horrid news from Kosovo, head-shaking editorials about how it represented the next act of the total dumbing down of television, the silly weather broadcasts and endless parade of bosoms, it never actually made any money, and in fact it lost its parent company, the Mirror Group, millions of pounds every year. So, to put it into context, UWA Wrestling Rampage was on the telly during Live TV's twilight period. No one really cared about what the channel was doing by this point, not many people were watching, and the clock was getting very close to midnight. You wonder how much the folks in charge of UWA knew about the state of play at Live, but surely there must have been some awareness. Mere weeks into Wrestling Rampage's run, articles were running in the papers saying that the channel was likely at death's door, only attracting interest from potential buyers who were eager to close it and take over their channel space, desperately trying to revamp itself and shedding some of its trashy images, binning the likes of topless starts and trying to focus on sport. Really, considering that the channel had initially made an offer to Brian Dixon's All-Star but were flatly turned down because they weren't offering the promotion any money in return, you can't imagine that the deal offered to a fledgling promotion like the UWA was a particularly good one beyond being able to say that they had a slot on national television. Chris Norrie and Adam Nathan's book all about Live TV, originally written in 1997, paints a pretty miserable picture about what working on the channel was like. The whole operation was gradually stripped down to virtually nothing, a staff so skeletal and a mood so chaotic that apparently the channel was only ever one misclick away from doing something disastrously stupid like, say, accidentally running a news package that Nick Ferrari had produced in case the Queen Mother passed away. Perhaps said package would have featured the news bunny solemnly winding the Union Jack down to half-mast. I don't know. In short, the closure of Live TV came as a surprise to absolutely nobody, and unless they utterly had their heads in the sand, I imagine the folks at UWA must have been at least a little bit aware of the state of things. So perhaps this explains a little why UWA Wrestling Rampage feels like such a rushed and badly booked show at times. The company had this run of 21 episodes, but I imagine it soon became clear that there wasn't going to be any more than that, certainly not with live TV. The channel was on borrowed time, so UWA should try and throw as much shit at the wall as they can, hopefully to try and get at least a bit of attention. The final 3 episodes of the show, taken from the last taping in Barking on 4th of September, do represent a bit of an improvement over the generally miserable and heatless Blackpool shows that preceded them, with an eagerness to actually wrap up some of the loose threads and move storylines to a conclusion. I wonder if by this time the UWA had figured out that the writing was on the wall, and they should at least make an effort to tie a bit of a bow around their TV run. Even the most optimistic people there must have figured out that even if there was going to be more television at some stage, it obviously wasn't going to be with live TV. Still, whatever they did wasn't enough for the promotion to keep on going following live TV's demise. Clearly no other channel was interested in picking them up, and the original UWA folded not long after that last taping in Barking. Phil Powers revived the UWA in 2002, and from the looks of things they ran shows in and around London and Essex up until 2021. I believe that nowadays Phil has his own British wrestling-centric channel called Rinslam on YouTube, and that he is or was involved with a wrestling school called School of Slam, where the training's headed up by Too Far Gone's Paul Tyrrell. And so we've just about finished our look at the Ultimate Wrestling Alliance and Wrestling Rampage. Again, it's far from the worst British wrestling thing. There's things like the infamous Wrestle Express saga that beat it handily, and that's surely a subject for another day. Hell, I'd definitely rather watch it over awful ITV things like Celebrity Wrestling, or their hopelessly average revival of World of Sport from a few years back, if only because of the nostalgia factor. Beyond British wrestling, another amusing part of this artifact is that, while it's easy to find American shows from the late 1980s that were trying, unsuccessfully, to ape the spectacle that was WWF at the time, it's not as easy to find a lot of things on television from the late 90s that aren't WWF, WCW or ECW, but are desperately trying to grab elements from all three, and UWA was kind of trying to do that. Ultimately, it didn't even come close. But there are signs with the UWA, at least with some of the young talents that were there, that perhaps we weren't too far away from the end of the worst of British wrestling's dark ages. This may be damning with faint praise, but it is a wholly original group generally comprised of wrestlers in their 20s, trying to do something a bit more modern and getting away from the older image of British wrestling, the glory days of the 70s and 80s that, even if those days were often very good, still largely haunted the scene. And even if it failed, it's surely better than watching a greased up 40-year-old bloke trying to cock a people's eyebrow in a dead holiday camp in Prestatyn. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time, bye for now.